The fire crackled in the distance, casting long, twisted shadows against the canyon walls. In the center of the clearing, tied to a crude wooden stake driven angrily into the cracked earth, stood Clara Bell. Her hands were bound behind her back, ankles lashed tight with coarse rope, and a dirt-stained cloth covered her eyes. But even in darkness, she didn't tremble. Clara had tasted injustice before, bitter and unrelenting, and now she was swallowing it whole with the quiet dignity of someone who knew she was right. She had spoken out. In a town where silence was survival and obedience was law, Clara dared to open her mouth. She was only 19, but her words struck like bullets. During Sunday's sermon in Dustwell, a forgotten speck of a town on the edge of nowhere, she called out rancher Samuel Greaves for hoarding stolen supplies and selling water from the public well. She accused Reverend Pierce of pocketing arms meant for orphans and using them to buy guns for the sheriff's men. Her voice echoed through the church like thunder. The next morning, posters littered the streets. Clara Bell, liar, instigator, threat to order. She didn't hide. Clara kept walking through town with her chin high, eyes forward, even as spit hit her boots and whispers followed her like vultures. But Dustwell didn't tolerate rebellion, especially not from a poor, half-native girl whose mother was Apache and whose father died before she turned 10. To them, Clara wasn't a citizen. She was a problem, a reminder of things they didn't want to admit. And so, a trial was held, if you could even call it that. At high noon in the town square, Clara was tied up while Sheriff Greaves, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, read a crumpled sheet of paper with fake authority. She was never allowed to speak in her defense. The crowd roared as the verdict was shouted. For subversion, inciting hatred, and blasphemy against the town of Dustwell, she shall be tied to the stake of silence until death, or until she begs forgiveness before God and man. Now she stood alone in the canyon, far from the town that betrayed her, guarded by 2 hired gunmen tasked with watching her soul burn clean. They sat around a small fire, passing whiskey and laughter back and forth. Not even the devil would waste his time on her, one of them scoffed. The other spat into the dust. Good riddance. But the wind that swept across the canyon floor was changing. It carried a sound, low, rhythmic, steady. Hoofbeats. Distant at first, but coming closer. On the ridge above the canyon, a figure appeared, silhouetted against the blood-orange sky. A lone rider. His horse was black as a starless night, his coat dust-worn and long, and a rifle hung from his saddle like a shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence cracked the air open like thunder before a storm. The 2 guards squinted up at him. "What in hell is that?" one muttered. "Trouble," the other answered, already reaching for his gun. The stranger didn't flinch. He dismounted slowly, tied his horse to a low-hanging branch, and walked toward them with deliberate purpose. He'd seen places like this before, heard the cries of people punished not for what they did, but for who they were. He hated it. Clara could hear the boots crunching over gravel. Even blindfolded, she knew something had shifted. The air felt different. There was the scent of tobacco, worn leather, and hope. The older guard raised his rifle. "You're not welcome here, stranger. This ain't your concern." The man's voice was calm, low, dangerous. When they tie a woman to a stake for speaking the truth, that's everyone's concern. The younger man let out a shaky laugh. "Big talk for one man." The stranger didn't blink. "Then it's a fair fight." Before they could move, he was faster. His hand flashed to his holster, and the revolver spoke twice. 2 clean shots. One guard fell screaming, clutching his shoulder. The other howled in pain, his leg useless beneath him. Neither dead. Just out of the way. Clara flinched at the shots. Then silence. But not the kind that feared death. This was the silence of something greater. Justice, maybe. The man approached her carefully, cut the ropes, and pulled the cloth from her face. She coughed, sucking in the freedom like air after drowning. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a brittle whisper. The man looked into her eyes, steady as stone. Someone tired of watching the truth die with a gag in its mouth. The sun had dipped below the ridge, painting the canyon in deep purples and bruised reds. Clara sat on a flat stone, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had bitten deep. The stranger knelt by the fire the guards had left behind, quietly stoking it back to life. He hadn't asked her questions, hadn't demanded thanks. He just moved with the quiet patience of a man who'd seen too much and expected worse. Finally, Clara spoke. "You know they'll come for me." The stranger didn't look up. He threw another stick into the flames and said, "They'll come for a lot of people before this is over." She stared at him, trying to read the lines of his face in the flickering light. He looked like a man who'd fought more battles than he'd won, but still stood anyway. "What's your name?" He hesitated, then answered without turning. "Gideon." She nodded slowly. Clara Bell. He already knew. He'd heard the name in whispered circles across the frontier. Tales of a girl with wildfire in her voice. Some called her foolish, others called her brave. Gideon had ridden 2 days straight to find her. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Gideon finally looked at her. His eyes were steel, but the kind sharpened by loss, not cruelty. "Because you remind me of someone I couldn't save." A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of untold stories. Then, distant howls shattered the stillness. Wolves, or worse. Gideon stood, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "We should move." Clara struggled to her feet. Her legs shook, her body weak from exposure, but she didn't complain. She followed him as he led the way out of the canyon, his steps sure, hers determined. They reached the horses Gideon had hidden nearby. One was his. The other, stolen from the guards, he offered to Clara. She hesitated, then mounted without a word. The moon was rising behind them, casting silver shadows on the trail as they rode east, away from Dustwell. But word travels fast in places soaked with fear. Back in town, Samuel Greaves was furious. The guards had crawled back into Dustwell half dead, babbling about a man in black and a girl who refused to die. Greaves paced inside his home, a massive oak-paneled fortress of greed, shouting at his deputies. "I want them found," he snarled. "Tonight, dead or alive." Reverend Pierce stood in the corner, silent and pale. He had watched this escalate beyond anything he'd imagined. His sermons had once inspired comfort. Now they served as weapons, and he knew it. "She'll talk," Greaves said. "She'll turn people against us. We can't let that happen." Sheriff Mays, a man more loyal to Greaves's wallet than any badge, nodded. "I'll send riders." Outside, the town remained silent. Windows were shuttered. Mothers clutched children a little tighter. Because somewhere in the distance, they knew the winds were shifting, and Clara Bell was still alive. Meanwhile, Gideon and Clara rode through the night, stopping only when the horses needed rest. At dawn, they reached a narrow pass between 2 jagged hills. Gideon dismounted, signaling Clara to do the same. "There's a cave up ahead," he said. "Safe for now." They entered the shadowed mouth of the hill. Inside, the air was cool, and the echoes swallowed their footsteps. Gideon unpacked supplies, dried meat, water, a small blanket. He handed them to Clara without ceremony. She ate slowly, watching him. "You're not just some drifter." He met her gaze but said nothing. "You've done this before," she continued. "Rescued people. Fought men like Greaves." Gideon leaned against the cave wall, arms crossed. "Used to be a lawman. A long time ago." "What happened?" His jaw clenched. "I enforced the wrong laws." Clara nodded, understanding more than he expected. She had grown up hearing about justice, but rarely seeing it. They rested for a few hours. When Clara awoke, Gideon was gone. Panic flared in her chest, but then she saw a note scrawled in charcoal on the wall. "Be back before sundown. Don't light a fire." He returned that evening with news and blood on his coat. "Greaves has riders searching every trail," he said. "They're not far." "Then we need to run," Clara said, standing. "No," Gideon replied. "We need to make a stand." Clara's brow furrowed. "What? Just the 2 of us?" He looked at her, calm but firm. "You want to run forever? Or you want the truth to matter?" She didn't answer, not with words, but her silence told him everything. They spent the next day preparing. Gideon showed her how to shoot, how to move like a ghost in open terrain. He didn't treat her like a child. He treated her like someone who had already survived hell and was ready to walk back through it to burn the whole system down. That night Clara sat by the edge of the cave, looking at the stars. "You ever think we're just dust in the wind?" she asked. Gideon shook his head. Dust doesn't fight back. The third morning rose cold and silent. A brittle wind swept through the hills, shaking the dry shrubs like nervous hands. Clara stood at the cave's entrance, rifle in hand, watching the trail below. She was no longer the girl who'd been tied to a stake 3 nights ago. There was fire in her stance now. Resolve in the way she held the weapon. The truth had burned her and made her stronger. Behind her, Gideon checked his saddlebag. He pulled out a map, unfolded it on a flat rock, and motioned Clara over. "There's a pass here," he said, pointing. "Narrow, steep. If they're coming, that's where they'll funnel through. If we set the right traps, we can slow them down." "You're planning to fight them head-on?" "Not fight," he said. "Expose." He looked up at her, his voice low. "We're not just defending ourselves, Clara. We're putting Greaves on trial." She stared at the map. "With bullets? With truth, and the kind of spectacle they can't ignore." Clara understood. The town had turned against her, because the lies were easier to swallow than the truth. But if those lies bled in the open, if Dustwell saw what its leaders really were, maybe fear would shift to justice. They spent hours setting up. A ridge above the pass gave a clear vantage point. Clara stacked rocks that could be pushed to collapse the narrow trail. Gideon planted oil-soaked cloth in a crevice where he could light it and flood the path with smoke. He'd used the tactic once in a border skirmish. The chaos would make them hesitate, and hesitation was survival. As dusk fell, Clara saw movement in the valley below. Riders, 4 of them. At first, then 6 more, 10 total, armed fast, hungry for blood. "Showtime," Gideon muttered. He lit the first fuse. The trail below erupted in smoke and confusion. Horses reared, men shouted. One rider fell off his mount as the flames licked the edge of the path. Clara, steady, aimed her rifle and fired once, striking a rifle from a man's hands without hitting flesh. They didn't want corpses. They wanted truth to be undeniable. "Up there!" someone shouted. "It's her!" Clara raised her voice, strong and sure. "I'm Clara Bell, the girl you tried to kill for telling the truth. I'm still standing." Bullets whizzed past her, but she didn't flinch. Gideon's voice rang out beside hers. "And I'm a former deputy who saw Dustwell's corruption with my own eyes. Greaves is no rancher. He's a thief and a liar who'd rather silence a girl than face what he's done." The smoke parted for a moment, and in that silence, one of the riders lowered his weapon, then another, but not all. 2 men broke through the chaos and started up the ridge. Gideon fired a warning shot. One stopped, the other didn't. He charged up the slope, revolver drawn. Clara turned, heart pounding. Her rifle clicked, empty. She drew a knife, eyes wide. Gideon stepped in, fast as a whip. He struck the man in the gut with the butt of his rifle, then threw him down the hill. Clara exhaled. "You okay?" Gideon asked. "I am now," she said. But more were coming. And Clara knew this wasn't just about Dustwell anymore. This was about every girl silenced, every person crushed by power they couldn't fight alone. She grabbed Gideon's hand. "We make our stand here." He nodded. Together. Down in the town, the sounds of distant gunfire reached Dustwell's wooden walls. People stepped out of their homes. A few climbed rooftops. They saw smoke curling from the north ridge, heard echoes of shouting. Some recognized the voice. "She's alive," murmured a woman near the saloon. In the church, Reverend Pierce trembled. He looked down at his trembling hands, remembering every lie he'd let slip through his sermons, every silence he maintained while men like Greaves ruled with fear. A boy burst into the room. Matthew, son of the blacksmith. "Mama says they're fighting outside the pass. She says Clara's out there." Pierce stood. "What else did she say?" "She said, maybe it's time somebody listened." Back on the ridge, Clara was crouched behind a rock, reloading her rifle with trembling fingers. Gideon knelt beside her, his shirt soaked with sweat and blood, not all of it his. "She's doing something to them," he muttered. Clara looked at him. "They came for blood, but now they're hearing her voice. Some of them are listening." He gave a tired smile. "That's more dangerous than any bullet." The wind picked up across the ridge, scattering dust and ash from the earlier fires. The remaining riders had pulled back to the tree line, regrouping, confused. Some yelled over each other. Others stared up at the figures on the hill, not like prey, but with something new in their eyes. Doubt. Clara stood tall, rifle back in her hands. Her voice rang out over the canyon like a hymn. "Every one of you knows I didn't lie. You know Greaves. You've seen what he does. Ask yourselves why he wanted me dead, instead of disproving what I said." Silence fell again. Then a voice rose from below. It was Levi Turner, a ranch hand who worked for Greaves. "They said you were poisoning the well, that you were spreading disease." Clara didn't flinch. "And you believed that? From a man who never drank from that well himself? A man who hoards medicine while children cough through the night?" A murmur rippled through the riders. Even at a distance, Clara could see the shift happening, the cracks forming in their conviction. Then a shot rang out, not from the ridge, but from behind the riders. A single shot that dropped one of the hesitant men to the dirt. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the trees. Samuel Greaves himself, dressed in black, with a long rifle and a face carved from stone. He looked up at Clara, his voice booming. "Enough!" The riders froze. "You listen to a girl who thinks words are weapons. She's a half-breed agitator. That man beside her, a disgraced law dog turned vigilante. You follow them and you're no better than traitors." Another rider shouted back, "That girl was tied to a stake!" Greaves's lip curled. "And she should have burned there." He raised his rifle, aiming not at Clara, but at Gideon. Clara saw it a second too late. "Down!" she screamed, tackling Gideon as the bullet tore through the air. It grazed her shoulder, spinning her sideways. Blood soaked her shirt, but she gritted her teeth and stood again. Gideon fired back, hitting the rifle from Greaves's hand, sending it clattering to the rocks below. "Stay down there, Greaves," he roared. "This isn't your gallows anymore." But Greaves wasn't alone. From the woods emerged more riders, men with covered faces, hired killers, their coats too clean to be local, brought in for one reason only, to end this. Gideon cursed under his breath. He hired mercenaries. Clara staggered next to him, gripping her wound. "We hold them," she said. "We don't let him bury this." But the odds had turned, from a standoff to a war. Back in Dustwell, the sound of hooves thundered down Main Street. A group of townsfolk rode hard, led by none other than Reverend Pierce. He carried no weapon, only his Bible and shame. Behind him rode Matthew the blacksmith, his apron still on, and Liza the schoolteacher, her hair tied back with a rifle across her lap. The people were rising. Word had spread. Clara Bell was still alive, and Greaves had sent killers to silence her for good. They rode toward the ridge. At the canyon pass, chaos exploded. Greaves's hired guns charged up the trail, shouting curses, bullets flying. Gideon and Clara fought side by side, him calm and surgical, her fierce and unrelenting. Every shot counted, every movement mattered, but they were being pushed back. Clara took a knee, reloading, when a man lunged toward her with a knife. Gideon turned, too far to intervene. Then, bang, the attacker dropped. Clara looked behind and saw the boy, Matthew, rifle smoking. "We're with you!" he yelled. Behind him, Dustwell's citizens came spilling over the ridge, surrounding Greaves's men like a tide. Liza shot a mercenary off his horse. The blacksmith swung a hammer into the ribs of another. Even Reverend Pierce stood between Clara and a gunman, arms outstretched, daring him to shoot. "You said she needed to burn," he whispered. "But it was our souls that were on fire." The tide turned fast. Greaves, now surrounded, tried to run, but Gideon caught him at the base of the ridge. Face to face, no words this time, just a punch that sent Greaves sprawling. He looked up at Gideon, sneering through broken teeth. "You think this changes anything? I own this town." Gideon holstered his weapon. "Not anymore." Clara walked forward, bloodied, limping, but standing. "You'll face trial, real trial." Greaves spat. "They'll never believe you." Then to his horror, a dozen townspeople stepped forward. "We do," said Liza. "We saw everything," added Reverend Pierce. "You hanged our trust," said Matthew. "Now it's your turn to swing." The canyon was silent now, but not with death, with awakening. Smoke hung low over the battlefield like a shroud of memory. The mercenaries had fled or fallen. The townspeople stood in a wide circle around Clara and Gideon, not as spectators, but as witnesses. Greaves lay on the ground, wrists tied with the very rope he had once ordered for Clara's execution. His lip was split, one eye swollen shut, but it was his pride that had suffered the fatal wound. Clara looked at the crowd, her voice hoarse but steady. "You saw what he did. You followed his orders. You helped tie me to that stake." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. Some people lowered their eyes, others nodded, slowly, in shame. Reverend Pierce stepped forward. His hands trembled as he pulled off his collar, letting it drop into the dust. "I preached obedience when I should have preached justice," he said. "I see that now. Clara, if there's anything I can do, then help build something better," she said. "Not for me, for the girls who speak after me." He bowed his head. The blacksmith came next. "I've got nails and lumber. If you want to tear down that gallows, I'll be the first to swing a hammer." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Gideon watched in silence, his face unreadable. Clara stepped closer to him. "Looks like they're listening now." He nodded. "For now. But it won't last unless we finish it," she said. "We bring the truth back with us. Every piece of it." He glanced at Greaves. "And you think they'll believe us over him?" "They don't have to believe. They just have to see." Back in Dustwell, the gallows stood tall in the center of town, a symbol of fear carved in wood. By the time Clara returned, her arm bandaged, her shirt still stained with blood, people gathered without being summoned. Word of Greaves' arrest had arrived hours before her. The sun was just starting to rise over the rooftops. Clara climbed the gallows steps, the same ones she'd nearly died on, and stood at the edge, looking out over the town that once sentenced her to silence. "I was tied to this post because I spoke," she said, her voice carried by the hush of the morning. "Not because I stole, not because I hurt anyone, because I told the truth about a man who used fear to keep you in line." She looked down at the rope still swinging in the breeze. "This was meant to kill me. Now it will stand as proof of what fear builds." She reached behind her and cut the rope clean with Gideon's knife. The crowd erupted in cheers. Samuel Greaves was dragged into the square by his own deputies, the ones who'd switched sides after seeing the truth. His head hung low, a man who once ruled by intimidation, now powerless in chains. The town council convened, openly, for the first time in years. And though Greaves demanded lawyers, excuses, delays, the people of Dustwell had already passed judgment. He was guilty of corruption, conspiracy, attempted murder. He'd stand trial in front of a regional judge, yes, but now it was Dustwell that delivered him there, not the other way around. And Clara, once condemned, had become the beating heart of a revolution. That night, Dustwell gathered for something it had never dared before, a town reckoning. The church was too small, so people filled the square, bringing chairs, lanterns, food. No one sat higher than another. No one shouted over the rest. Clara spoke last, not of revenge, not of bitterness, of healing, of the long road ahead. "We broke something today," she said. "Not just a noose, not just a lie. We broke the silence." Gideon stood nearby, leaning against a post, watching, listening. She turned to him as the crowd dispersed and said quietly, "You should go. You were never meant to stay." He hesitated. "Maybe not," he said. "But it feels like I've been riding all this time just to end up here." She smiled. "You came when no one else did. That doesn't go away." He looked at her, eyes full of memory. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he said. "You weren't," she replied. "You were something better." 3 weeks passed. The gallows came down plank by plank. Dustwell didn't celebrate its demolition. No speeches, no ceremony, just hammers, saws, and the quiet breathing of a town learning how to start over. Clara worked beside the blacksmith, her wounded shoulder still stiff, but her grip steady. The wood creaked as it fell. No one cried, but something beneath the surface, grief or relief, no one could name it, stayed in the silence. At sunset, they burned what remained. No one spoke as the flames took it. The children watched. They needed to see it end. Gideon packed his saddlebag the next morning. The trail waited. Dustwell was not his home, and never would be. That much he'd always known. But this time, he wasn't running from ghosts. He was leaving some behind. Clara met him at the edge of town. She wore a long coat against the cold, and her rifle strapped across her back. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the storm of someone who'd weathered more than one kind of fire. He tied off his gear, then turned to her. No badge, no law, just a direction. She nodded. That's all a man like you ever needed. He looked past her to the town. They'll be watching you now. I know, she said. Let them. She handed him a parcel. Inside, a piece of the gallows. A single bolt of scorched iron. He turned it over in his hand. So you don't forget what almost happened here, she said. I never forget, he answered. He swung into the saddle. The horse shifted beneath him, restless. Clara stepped back. The wind picked up, lifting her hair from her face. He hesitated. Clara. She raised a hand. You said everything that mattered. He nodded once, then kicked the horse into a trot. Dustwell faded behind him with every step. And still, he carried something of it inside him. Burned wood, quiet courage, and a girl with a voice that couldn't be broken. The church bell rang for the first time in a year. Not for a funeral, not for fire, but for a town meeting. No one stood at the pulpit. The benches were even. Voices were equal. A vote was cast to rebuild the well house, another to reopen the school, a final one to establish new laws that required proof, not prejudice, testimony, not whispers. The Reverend didn't speak. He sat among the rest, listening like a man learning to pray all over again. Outside, children chalked drawings on the side of the mercantile. One of them sketched a rider with a long coat and a wide hat. Another drew a girl standing tall, her hand raised, not in surrender, but in defiance. Clara passed them with a soft smile. No one looked away. Not anymore. In a valley 2 towns over, a merchant unpacked a shipment of stolen goods returned by a stranger on horseback. In a settlement across the ridge, a young girl stood before her schoolmates and told them what she saw in the forest, the sheriff's men lighting fires and blaming others. She didn't cry when they jeered. She just kept talking, because now they'd all heard of Dustwell. Somewhere beyond the desert, Gideon stopped to water his horse. The sky was wide, the horizon broken only by thorn and rock. He pulled the piece of scorched metal from his saddlebag, ran his thumb over the edges. He didn't speak, but his eyes, set on the road ahead, narrowed like a man who knew the weight of silence and what it cost to break it. He put the metal back in his coat, mounted up, and rode on. The dust behind him swirled for a long time before settling. The wind carried nothing but the sound of hooves, and far behind, the faintest echo of a girl's voice, still speaking, still heard.